Hello, my name is Elizabeth Matz-Puddle. This is my presentation titled An Overview of RtI, Assessing At-Risk Students. In this presentation, I'm going to discuss what RtI is, some of the core components of RtI, the general goals of RtI, and how the process begins. I'll talk about common universal screeners, how students are identified, what false negatives or false positive are. We'll talk about some of the guidelines for selecting screeners, and then jump into providing interventions, progress monitoring. I'll talk a little bit about how RtI is used in identification for special services, and in the end of the presentation, some of the key components to a successful RtI team. So we'll begin with what is RtI. Based on the definition provided by the National Research Center on Learning Disabilities, Berkeley et al. Provided this definition that RtI is student-centered assessment models that use problem-solving and research-based methods to identify and address learning difficulties in children. Torgensen kind of broke this down into two views of RtI. He says that RtI can be looked at from the response to intervention instructional approach, which is that tiered model that most of us think of, as far as the green being tier 1 and the yellow being tier 2 and the red being tier 3, and how the interventions intensify with each level. He also stated that response to intervention could be viewed from a diagnostic approach, which is where we look at it as a means of qualifying students for special services. So in very common terms, this means RtI is a multi-tiered framework. Typically we think of it as 3 tiers, but in some schools, districts, states, there are more than 3. There can be 4 or 5. It really just depends on the needs and of the students and kind of the range of abilities that you have. RtI is an assessment of students for identification of those students that may be at risk. And the definition of at risk also changes by state, district. It's something we'll talk about later in the presentation. Overall, RtI can be looked at as a model for organizing and delivering reading instruction, writing instruction, math instruction, and in some states they use it for behavior purposes as well. Here we have that pyramid that is commonly thought of when we hear the words RtI. On the right-hand side is that traditional response to intervention triangle or pyramid that has 80% of your students in the green. Those are meeting benchmark. That is considered your tier 1. The tier 2 is the yellow part in the middle there where it says targeted intervention, and that's about 15% of students that are receiving those more intensive than general education. And about 5% of the student population is receiving very intensive interventions. This is what we see typically. Abbott and Willis conducted a study where they looked at how to provide response to intervention model within urban schools or schools where a large percentage of the students come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And their triangles or their pyramids are turned upside down. Essentially, about 20 or 40% of their student body is in that tier 1 where they're at benchmark or exceeding benchmark. The vast majority of the population in the school is in that red section, which would be a tier 3 intervention, 60 to 80% of the students need really intensive interventions. The section in the middle that would be for your tier 2 interventions is really slim. They've found that while it doesn't mean that they are not being provided, it's not a large percentage. It's not like in this traditional pyramid there where you see 15%. So when you have a setting like this where your pyramid is upside down, you still would use response to intervention in the same way, but because you have such a large percentage of students that are in that red section, you'll have to pool a lot more of your resources to be able to provide the students with all of the supports that they need to be able to turn your pyramid the right side up. Here we have some of the core components of RtI. The first component there is high quality classroom instruction. As I stated before, frequently the first tier within a 3-tier system is high quality classroom instruction. It's where everything begins from. The second core component is universal screening. After you've screened your students and placed them into tiers, the third component there is continuous progress monitoring. You can't just put kids into a tier and leave them there and never come back to see if they've moved. That's more like tracking than response to intervention. The fourth tier there is, or fourth component there is research-based interventions. That's what you use within your tiers. And the fifth component is the fidelity of instructional interventions. And what that essentially means is that if you take a program or a published intervention and you provide it within a classroom to a group of students, providing it exactly the way that the manufacturer has, or the publisher has meant for it to be used. Because if you leave out components or change it because you don't think something is necessary, you're making it so that you're not following it with fidelity. So all of these components here have to come together in order for RtI to really work and be successful. The goal of RtI talks about here how in 2004 the reauthorization of the Individuals with Disabilities Act made the use of RtI acceptable as an alternative means of identifying students with specific learning disabilities. So the goal of RtI is to identify students early who might be at risk of later on developing problems academically that would put them behind their peers. It is basically a preventative service or used for that qualification for special services. So this is beginning the process, and the first point here says that universal screening is the first critical step, but many people would argue that the first critical step would be to ensure that students are receiving high quality initial instruction and have reasonable interventions in their classroom already. That really is the basis. After you're sure that you have that high quality instruction, that all your kids have had time to receive that instruction, you would move on to really the first critical step, which is universal screening. Universal screening would be how you test your whole student body to determine the levels that they're currently achieving academically. The screening can occur in more than one academic area. So again, it can be done in reading, math, writing, and it consists of brief assessments. Sometimes it's one assessment, sometimes it's assessments that are brief but over a period of time. Those are called multi-measure or single measure assessments. common universal screeners are varying depending upon the state or the school district. And basically what a common universal screener is how you test your kids to determine that basic level and determine which kids are at risk for falling behind or that may already be behind. You can use curriculum-based measurements, the dynamic indicators of basic early literacy skills, or DIBELS, is a very common one. There are 15,000 schools across the country who currently, or as of 2009, use the DIBEL data system, mainly because it's free. The measures are free. So that means that millions of students are using this. However, not all states who use it use the same subtests. There's also Ames Web, the Woodcock-Johnson revised version. Some universal screeners are just subtests of the Woodcock reading mastery test. Also, the Texas Primary Reading Inventory is commonly used. The elements of ideal screeners. So these are the things that you would want to look for in a screener that would make it the most appealing of all your options for screening. The first point there is sensitivity. So sensitivity refers to the degree to which a screening mechanism reliably identifies at-risk students who perform unsatisfactorily on future criterion measures. The specificity refers to the degree to which the screening mechanism that you use accurately identifies students who later perform unsatisfactorily on those criterion measures. These are later referred to as true negatives. The practicality is a big one. When I was doing my research for this presentation, I ran into it over and over and over again. And they talked about, in all the studies, how an effective screening measure has to be practical. It needs to be brief and simple. It needs to be able to quickly identify students who are lagging behind their peers. That it shouldn't require a specialist, a school psychologist, or someone to administer it, because you want to be able to easily administer it. That it needs to be fairly inexpensive, because the reality is that schools are watching budgets. The last point there is consequential validity, which basically means that screening measures don't do any harm to the students and that they're linked to really effective interventions. This next slide here talks about the false negative, false positive. And I really liked this visual to explain this because it was something that I thought we often read about: true positives, false negatives, true negatives, and there's so many trues and falses and negatives and positives that it can be confusing. So within this matrix you can see that you have a desired outcome, which you want your students to be able to do, and you screen them using one of the universal screeners. And you have students that fail your screener, and you have students that pass your screener. So within this, you wind up with these four pools, essentially, of students. You have students that are at risk, who when they take your screener, they fail it. And they are the ones called true positives, who are really at risk for future academic difficulties. You also have those students who are at risk, who pass your screener. And those are in box B. They're considered false positive. And like I said, they're ones that somehow, they passed it, but they really are going to fall behind when you look down the road. You also have the students who are not at risk. And they take your screener and they fail it. Even though they're not at risk, they fail it. That's box C there, where it says false negative. False negatives are the students who aren't at risk. They maybe just had a bad day, or it wasn't a test that accurately measured, what they could do. In box D, you have students that are not at risk who passed your test. And that box D is true negative.